and it ended up being one of the most enjoyable relationships I've ever had.
There is a difference between the love that stays and the love that shapes you forever. For decades, Robert Redford appeared effortless. The smile felt natural, the confidence unforced. A man who seemed as though life had simply unfolded in his favor. But lives rarely unfold that way. On September 16, 2025, the world said goodbye to Robert Redford at the age of 89. Tributes poured in for the films, the fame, the legacy. Yet behind all of that lived a quieter truth, one he never turned into headlines. Because long before Hollywood knew his name, before success hardened him into a symbol, there was a woman who loved the unfinished man. Not the star, not the legend. The boy still finding his way. At 89, in the silence of reflection, Robert Redford finally let one truth stand without explanation. She was the love of his life. Before fame, before control. Before the world learned his name, Robert Redford was not calm, polished, or certain. He was restless, unsettled, carrying grief he didn't yet have language for. The loss of his mother at a young age left a quiet vacancy that no amount of charm could fill, and by his early 20s, Redford was drifting, through jobs, through moods, through a sense that something in him was unfinished. That was the man Lola Van Wagenen met. She didn't meet a future star. She met a young man still unsure whether he belonged anywhere at all. Lola was steady where he was searching, thoughtful where he was impulsive. She believed in education, community, and purpose. Things Redford admired, but hadn't yet learned how to anchor himself to. They married young, without money, without certainty, and without any guarantee that his dreams would ever materialize. There were no red carpets, no cameras waiting, just small apartments, shared doubts, and long conversations about what kind of life they wanted to build. What mattered most was this: Lola loved him before success taught him how to protect himself. She knew his silences. She understood his frustration. And when he talked about acting, often with more hope than confidence, she didn't laugh or warn him to be realistic. She listened. That kind of belief leaves a mark. It becomes part of how a person learns to see himself. Years later, Redford would master restraint. He would become famously private, almost unreachable. But in those early years, there was no distance yet, only vulnerability, only a man still willing to be seen. And that is why this chapter matters, because the love that arrives before achievement doesn't compete with fame later. It defines it. Some people don't fall in love with who you become. They fall in love with who you are before the world interferes. Marriage in the shadow of ambition. Marriage did not calm Robert Redford's restlessness. It gave it direction. With Lola Van Wagenen beside him, his dreams no longer felt reckless, but they were still demanding. Acting required absence. Auditions meant rejection. And progress came slowly, measured in small roles and long stretches of waiting. While Redford chased possibility, Lola carried stability. She managed the home, raised their children, and held together a life that rarely made room for predictability. Money was tight, moves were frequent, and the future was always just out of reach. This was not the glamorous beginning Hollywood later romanticized. It was exhaustion disguised as optimism. Redford was ambitious, but ambition has a cost when it's still unpaid. Each audition took him further from the man who once sat still long enough to explain his fears. Each small success pulled him toward a version of himself that required emotional discipline, control, restraint, silence. Lola noticed the shift before anyone else did. She watched him learn how to compartmentalize disappointment, how to absorb rejection without showing it. These skills would later make him magnetic on screen. But at home, they created distance. Not cruelty, not betrayal, just space where closeness used to live. Yet she stayed. She believed in the work even when the work demanded more of him than he could give back. Her support wasn't loud. It didn't come with speeches or ultimatums. It came in consistency. the kind that doesn't announce itself but holds everything up. This was the paradox of their marriage. The more she helped him become strong, the less he needed to lean. And slowly, without argument or blame, love began to carry weight. Some sacrifices don't break a relationship. They simply change its shape. The loss that changed everything. There are moments in a life that divide everything into before and after. For Robert Redford and Lola Van Wagenen, that moment came with the loss of their son. Grief did not arrive loudly. It settled in slowly, heavily, and without instructions. They mourned the same child, but not in the same way. Lola turned inward, holding pain close, trying to preserve meaning where she could. Redford did something different. He closed doors inside himself, not out of indifference, but survival. He had never been taught how to sit with sorrow, only how to endure it. This loss changed him more than fame ever did. Friends later noticed his growing discomfort with personal questions. Interviews became guarded. Emotion was filtered, measured, controlled. What the public would eventually call privacy was, in truth, a wound learning how not to reopen. For a marriage already stretched by ambition, grief became an unbearable weight. Not because love disappeared, but because sorrow reshaped how love could be expressed. Comfort turned awkward. Silence replaced reassurance. Two people standing in the same room, hurting in parallel, unable to reach each other the way they once had. Lola understood the pain, but she could not carry it alone. This was not a dramatic breaking point. There were no scandals, no explosive arguments, just the slow realization that something essential had shifted and could not be restored to its original shape. Years later, Redford would rarely speak of this loss, and when he did, it was briefly, carefully, as if naming it too fully might undo the walls he had built to survive. This was the moment the world never saw, the moment when love remained, but innocence did not. Some grief doesn't end relationships. It changes who we are inside them. Fame arrived, distance followed. By the time fame finally arrived, Robert Redford was already a different man. Success didn't transform him. It confirmed the version of himself that grief and ambition had shaped. Hollywood rewarded his restraint, his quiet authority, his ability to say more by revealing less. On screen, that discipline was magnetic. Off-screen, it made closeness harder to sustain. As offers multiplied, time at home disappeared. Travel became constant. Expectations grew heavier. And the man who once shared doubts freely now carried responsibility in silence. Fame didn't introduce distance into the marriage. It simply gave it momentum. Lola Van Wagenen watched as the world embraced him for qualities she had seen forming years earlier. The composure, the control, the emotional economy. But what the public admired was born from private cost she had helped absorb. Their separation did not arrive as a shock to those closest to them. There were no accusations, no public unraveling, just an understanding that the life he was building no longer fit the life they had started together. When the marriage ended, it did so quietly. Redford never spoke poorly of Lola. Not then, not later. There were no revisionist stories, no attempts to rewrite the past. That silence was not avoidance, it was respect. She had known him before the myth hardened, and he never denied that. Afterward, the world would see him with other women, relationships that looked calmer, more compatible, less strained. But something fundamental had changed. The man now knew how to protect himself, how to keep parts of his heart unreachable. Fame had given him control, but it had also taught him what distance could preserve. And still, behind every later chapter, there remained the woman who had loved him before any of it was necessary. Some endings aren't failures. They're acknowledgments that a season has passed. The question we rarely ask. Before the story moves forward, it's worth stopping here. Because what happened between Robert Redford and Lola Van Wagenen is not unusual. It's simply unspoken. Most lives are shaped by one person who knows us before we become efficient, careful, or successful. Someone who sees the unfinished edges, the uncertainty, the hope that still feels fragile, and often that person does not walk with us to the end. Not because love was weak, but because life asked different things of each of us. Redford would go on to build a life admired for its control and independence. Lola would continue her work, grounded in purpose and conviction. They did not erase each other from their stories. They simply stopped sharing the same chapter. This is where many people look away, because reflection asks something uncomfortable. Who knew you before you learned how to be strong? Who believed in you before results made belief easier? Sometimes the love that shapes us most is not the one that lasts longest, but the one that teaches us who we are capable of becoming. The story isn't over yet, but from this point forward, everything Redford builds will carry the quiet imprint of what came first. Not all love stories end in goodbye. Some end in remembrance. Other loves, but never the same. After the marriage ended, Robert Redford did what many people do after a long, formative love. He kept moving forward without looking back publicly. New relationships entered his life. Companionship returned. Stability, too. From the outside, it appeared that the past had been neatly placed behind him. But patterns tell their own story. Those who knew Redford well noticed that something fundamental had changed. He chose partners carefully. He guarded his privacy fiercely. The man who once allowed himself to be fully known now revealed only what was necessary. Love was present, but it was managed. This was not cynicism. It was self-preservation. In later years, Redford spoke often about independence, about the importance of solitude, about protecting what is private. These ideas were frequently misunderstood as aloofness. In truth, they were the result of a man who had already given deeply once and learned what it cost. None of the women who followed were treated poorly. There was respect, loyalty, quiet affection. But none of those relationships carried the raw vulnerability of the first, because vulnerability, once reshaped by loss and time, rarely returns in its original form. And always, without being named, Lola Van Wagenen remained the reference point. She was the woman who knew him before ambition demanded armor, before grief taught restraint, before fame required distance. Every later connection existed in the shadow of that earlier truth, not as a comparison, but as a foundation. Redford never publicly declared one love greater than another. He didn't need to. His consistency did it for him. The way he spoke, the things he avoided saying, the respect he never withdrew. Some loves are loud, others are permanent. What comes after first love may be meaningful, but it is rarely untouched. The Quiet Confession at 89. By the time Robert Redford reached 89, he had outlived the noise. The arguments about stardom no longer mattered. The need to explain himself had faded. What remained was clarity, the kind that arrives when a life has already been lived. On September 16, 2025, Redford passed away. In the days that followed, the world spoke about films, influence, and legacy, but those closest to the truth noticed something else. In his final reflections, there was no grand statement, only consistency. The same name that had quietly shaped every chapter before, Lola Van Wagenen. Redford never staged a dramatic confession. He didn't need to. His life had already said it. The woman he protected from spectacle. The marriage he never diminished. The respect he never withdrew, even decades later. These were not accidents. They were decisions. In old age, he spoke less about achievement and more about meaning, about early belief, about the people who know you when there is nothing to gain. He understood something many only realize too late. Fame introduces many faces, but only a few witness your becoming. Lola was that witness. She knew him before ambition disciplined his emotions, before grief taught restraint, before the world demanded a version of him that could be consumed without explanation. And even after love changed form, it never lost its gravity. At 89, with nothing left to prove, Redford allowed that truth to stand without decoration. not in headlines, but in how he remembered, in what he chose to protect, in what he never replaced. This was not nostalgia, it was recognition. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud. They reveal themselves over a lifetime. The love that never needed replacing. When we look back at the life of Robert Redford, it's tempting to measure it by awards, films, and influence. But the truest measure of a life is often quieter than that. It lives in the people who knew us before success explained us away. For Redford, that truth rested with Lola Van Wagenen, the woman who believed first, stayed longest, and never needed recognition to matter. Their love didn't survive in photographs or public declarations. It survived in restraint, respect, and remembrance. Some loves don't ask to be replaced. They ask only to be honored. If this story reminded you of someone who shaped your life before the world intervened, take a moment with that memory. And if you value stories told with dignity, reflection, and truth, stay with us. There are still many lives worth remembering, quietly and well.